Tobias Ellwood joins me first, former chair of the Defence Select Committee, who's currently an active Army reservist and Conservative MP for Bournemouth East. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
I presume you welcome this ambition, at least on the part of Keir Starmer.
I would certainly welcome. There's a growing discussion, I think, has been taking place. Interesting that you spoke about this yesterday. The penny is dropping, just how vulnerable our economy is to those shifting sands that you spoke of, the changing and strengthening of authoritarian alliances. I don't think anybody has any doubts that the world certainly feels ever more dangerous, but we still dare not contemplate where our history is potentially taking us. Our adversaries are moving their economies, their industries to a war footing, but the West remains largely in denial. And in Europe, as you were just implying there, Putin's now the most powerful leader on the continent. He's removed all opposition voices and he's pivoted his new economy directly to support the war and to shift also towards China and Iran rather than Europe. He's now more powerful than Stalin, with the same ambitions of Stalin to expand his influence in the east of Europe. So it isn't just us, the UK, that needs to advance its defence spending, but the whole of NATO as well.
And when
question I would then pose before people leap to that and say, yes, increase the budget from 54 billion, I think it is now, to 90 billion, is to ask where you would place that money. You talk to the Army, they want more tanks, more personnel. The Navy obviously want more ships, and the Air Force would want more planes. But we need to actually understand the types of threats that are coming over the horizon, and then carefully calibrate how we then advance our defense posture, working with our allies as well, because it's a multitude of threats that we face. It's not as simple as it was in the Cold War.
People might remember that exchange you had with the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson when you were the chair of the Defence Select Committee, where you were really heavily critical of exactly where he was planning to spend money and how he was preparing, or the government under him was preparing, to develop our defence picture, the design of our defence. Remind us again what you were concerned about then, and are you still concerned about it now?
Yeah. Well, there was a recognition that, as I was just touching on, that it isn't just the conventional forces that need to be upgraded. We are now hugely exposed because of the digital plane that we operate in. 95% of our data comes from undersea cables, for example. Cybersecurity is absolutely so critical. It only took one line of incorrect code in the Heathrow to bring that crashing down. Imagine if that had been done deliberately. So what Boris Johnson did was invest more in our space and our cyber capabilities and our defense, but at the cost of then reducing our Army, our Air Force and our Navy. And I then said, you can't do that because, as I touched on at the beginning, there is a symbiotic relationship between our economy and our security. If you back down on security, our economy is affected. And the two biggest examples of that are Ukraine, with those grain ships not able to get out of Odessa. That caused food inflation here to 19%. And of course, in the Red Sea as well, where we're now doing good work to protect international shipping. If that has to go all the way around Africa, that impacts all of us. The prices of goods and services and so forth go up here in the UK.
And what I remember from that exchange, as much as the elements you described there, is that the Prime Minister at the time, he seemed to be dismissive of the idea that, land artillery, tanks, that kind of thing needed to be the focus. And actually, I know you disagreed, but in a sense, the war on Ukraine, because it's not quite the war it's the war on Ukraine by Russia, that is being fought in that way, isn't it? Not solely, but heavily so.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the assumption was that, yes, in the last 30 years, we've got to be honest and say we've had it pretty easy. We've had a real challenge to do with asymmetric warfare, to do with terrorism and so forth. But state-on-state attacks didn't happen. That's now back with a vengeance. We've seen that in Ukraine. And we're suddenly recognizing that we need land forces. You need to be able to control what's going on the battlefield. Ukraine is a great exemplar of where modern battles are going. Drones, the impact of that as well. And it's really interesting actually to see Grant Shapps announce the Dragon fire laser, which is being introduced. Really, cutting edge stuff. Really brilliant to see the procurement cycle being expedited to make sure we get these on naval ships. There's sort of innovation that Britain is absolutely good at. But it shows, again, you can't just throw money at the MOD. We need to look carefully. going back to protecting the UK, London has no air defense right now. A drone could come in, and unless a Type 45 was nearby, it could be pretty dangerous. We have no tactical nuclear weapons. Now, do we need them? I sadly suspect one will be used in Eastern Europe, a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon, in the next 5 years. That's a profound statement.
And for people who don't know what you mean by
we
tactical,
need to address.
People who don't know what you mean by tactical, because we don't want to frighten people. I mean, it's frightening enough if you're near it, but we don't want to frighten people.
No. It simply is like a massive conventional bomb that could take out a football pitch or a garrison, for example. But it will be nuclear. So it won't be what we saw in Nagasaki or Hiroshima or anything to do with Oppenheimer and so forth. It will be far smaller. But you'll be opening up that Pandora's box of a nuclear weapon being used. We have none of those. So how would we respond? These are the very difficult questions, not just for Britain, but for NATO as well. And Britain has led very much on European security in the last century. If Donald Trump, I make this very clear, does get in, then there's a lot of homework to be done, because I think America will reduce its interest in what's going on. They made that very, very clear indeed, which is why seeing Ukraine win in Russia is all the more important. Otherwise, I tell you, that spells a new era of insecurity for Europe.
And when you describe an economy being on a war footing, describe that in relation to the UK. What would that look like?
Well, at the moment, we've done a brilliant job in supporting Ukraine with stockpiles of weapon systems. But we know, because of the just-in-time approach to our economy that we've enjoyed in the last couple of decades, that's no longer appropriate when it deals with being able to procure and make sure. Ukraine and Russia are great examples. Russia is now being able to procure or get its hands on 5 million artillery shells a year. Now, across the whole of the rest of NATO, we're at 1 million. Straight away, that shows you how we've got to make sure that businesses that perhaps don't invest in military hardware and so forth are able to have a dual capability. Likewise, we can't keep a standing army, much as we'd like to. But if you look at all the Scandinavian models there, every individual is trained in some form when they're 18 to be able to understand, if they're required to be called up at short notice, how to hold a gun, how to participate in some form of defense. And these are difficult questions for us to embrace again, but we have to, because that's the scale of the threat that is now going to emanate over the next decade. We're in for a bumpy 10 years, there's no doubt about it.
But why was that not the case during the Cold War? The idea of a civilian force being turned into a quasi-military force, should it be needed?
Well, to some degree it was, but we were spending 4% of our GDP on defense. So instead of we're down to 1 or 2 divisions now. 1 division, I think we could mobilize. We had 6 divisions.
But nobody then was suggesting, I mean, I was a kid at the time, nobody was suggesting that every 18-year-old before you went off to uni did a year's civil defence training. Is that the kind of thing you're suggesting?
Well, this is a conversation that we need to have. I'm not going to spell out exactly what my proposal will be. James Heappey touched on this as well, as has Patrick Mercer, the head of the army at the moment, that we need to get our heads around the fact that there are very bad people that are linking together. Our world is splintering, I'm afraid, into those that support the world order as it is, the West and so forth, and those that are pursuing and exploiting our weaknesses in being able to underline it and linking together this axis between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, plus its One Belt, One Road program that China is pursuing, means a lot of voices across the global south are silenced.
Do you include Turkey in that grouping?
Well, Turkey is an interesting one, because they should be supporting NATO as a NATO ally, as a member of Europe as well. But they're a great example whereby the West's hesitance in standing up and making clear what we stand for is now being perhaps challenged by Turkey, that because of Russia's clever interests in leaning on countries such as not only Turkey, but Hungary as well. Slovakia is the latest one as well. That's causing problems within NATO too, that we're seeing perhaps a hesitance in wanting to support what we stand for, what we believe in, what we're willing to defend. And America, hesitating on its $60 billion worth of support for Ukraine, is the best example of this. Ukraine needs to win. If Russia is able to claim any sort of victory, it won't stop in Ukraine. It'll move further.
OK, Tobias Ellwood, good to talk to you. Interesting. Former chair of the Defence Select Committee, currently an active Army reservist and Conservative MP for Bournemouth.